Welcome to Rethinking the Dollar. Today I'm excited to have my guest, Mr. Andrew Moran. He's a journalist as well as an author over at andrewmoran.wordpress.com. And today he's joining us to share his thoughts on the global economy, as well as to share with us his work, his book, The War on Cash. So Andrew, welcome to Rethinking the Dollar.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you sitting down with me to share your work, the book, The War on Cash. Looking forward to diving into it. And so before we actually get into those questions in regards to your book, I'd like to start off with some Rethinking the Dollar questions. And the first question is, what comes to mind when Andrew Moran hears the words Rethinking the Dollar?
Well, I generally ask the question, what took so long? It's only a matter of time before people started to rethink the dollar. The Federal Reserve has been the architect of the dollar's ruination since it's pretty much the inception of the Federal Reserve. The dollar has lost about 90% of its value. It costs you about $24, $25, $26 to buy something that used to cost you only $1. When you have a $4.5 trillion balance sheet, you're going to inevitably have inflation. So rethinking the dollar is something that most people are probably doing right now, especially as they realize that their savings are being destroyed by inflation. It takes more dollars to buy grocery items at the local grocery store, and that's the income inequality through the well-connected, through the elite, seem to be always doing well, while everyone else suffers through the inflationary tax. So rethinking the dollar is something very important. I'm glad a website like yours is waking a lot of people up and educating them and showing them that fiat hegemony isn't always the right course of action to take for a country, and sound money is something that everyone should embrace.
All right, I do agree. Now, the whole idea of rethinking the dollar is to basically to help people become more monetarily aware. And so I believe that, school basically gives you a smidget of financial education as far as what to do and how to with your money, but it doesn't really tell you what money actually is. So with that being the case, why do you think, if you do, that this particular subject of monetary awareness in history is probably more important now than any time in human history?
That's an interesting question, because if you look at the global economy, not just the United States dollar, but the entire global market, you have $12 trillion worth of negative bonds. You have a currency war going on between different nations. They were trying to have a race to the bottom. Again, as I previously alluded to, people's savings accounts are being destroyed. And it's all because supposedly of the smartest men in the room. They know how to manage a money supply, although that is something that's very complicated. I mean, the United States alone has a near gross domestic product. So there's absolutely no way anyone could essentially plan an economy through monetary policy. So when you have the financial crisis from a few years ago, and the inevitable economic collapse is going to happen in the future due to all this debt and inflation, people start to educate themselves about monetary policy. Now, of course, there is some information out there that is incorrect. There's some information out there that is too vague, and then there's information out there that is too complicated to understand. So when you have rudimentary educational tools such as Rethinking the Dollar, or you have political comment or economic commentators out there who have a great understanding of, let's say, Austrian economics, and they can educate you about how fiat currencies aren't the way to go, and that debt, inflation, budget deficits only hurts the average person and doesn't help them, and it only helps the elites and the well-connected.
All right, well said, well said. Now, you hinted at the idea of some type of collapse down the line, and so that lets me know that, you are probably forecasting or seeing something that's probably inevitable. And so if you were given a chance to, I guess, be in front of the entire globe, whether it be in front of a podium or, say if people started to see Rethinking the Dollar more, and they started to, really ask questions, how would you describe, if you were asked, what's the state of the global economy?
Well, one thing I definitely wouldn't do, I wouldn't make a prediction as to when the global financial crisis would occur. But it is something that is inevitable. In the United States, you have the boom that's been going on for nearly a decade. And the boom has been fueled by credit expansion and inflationary expansion. And it provides the illusion. And it's based on debt, on debt, on debt. The global economy is pretty much run the way. As I previously mentioned, there's the negative bond market is $12 trillion worth. You have countries inflating their money supplies. Sound money is a foreign concept now to most bankers. You have the average person seeing their bills skyrocket. Their credit card bills are keeping them alive. They're hardly staying afloat. Now, I don't want to be a Cassandra and just promote negative prognostications, but the global state of affairs isn't quite healthy, and you have to protect yourself. And the one way to do that is through monetary education and economic education and personal finance education. And one of those ways is rethinking the United States dollar and the greenback. That is especially important in a time when currency wars are going to amplify, at a time when inflation is going to accelerate, especially over the next few years, when you have the United States government spending $1 trillion on infrastructure spending, and then you have a Federal Reserve trying to raise interest rates dramatically in order to combat the inflation, which is going to hurt people who are deeply in debt. It's going to hurt governments that are deeply in debt. And other countries are going to eventually, hopefully, follow suit anyway by raising rates. Of course, we don't have a market interest rate, which is something that we should do. Everything is just artificial and based on a few people in a Federal Open Market Committee, or a few people at a central bank in Japan, or in Brussels, or in Ottawa. And the global economic state, everyone would like it to be rosy, but it's just an illusion. And of course, the illusion that doesn't necessarily destroy your wealth, but it does bring you back to reality. And if you have to have a proper economic recovery, not the recovery that we've seen over the last few years that has been fueled by just printing money, artificially lowering interest rates, and going deeply into debt. And excuse me, and the economic affairs will only worsen over the next few years as the boom starts to slowly fade away and enter the bus cycle.
Right. Now, early on you hinted at the idea of currency wars, and so that kind of leads into your book, The War on Cash. Explain to me a little bit, I guess, how did that book come about? What made you decide to, put your pen to pad and paper and whatnot and put it down on paper to educate people? So how did that come about? And give us a little insight into that work.
Well, it happened first when I read an article in the New York Times about how the Swedish homeless people actually have processed payment systems whereby people swipe or tap or insert their plastic cards in order to pay for a homeless magazine or newspaper that's being offered by the homeless person itself. So the homeless in Sweden don't have the antiquated system of just giving them change for a magazine or to give them coffee. And then as time went by, there were constantly reports about how certain denominations of currencies are being wiped away, or you have economists talking about how you have to eliminate certain currencies or denominations of currencies, and central bankers reiterated pretty much the same thing in order to supposedly protect the citizens from crime, drugs, and terrorism. And then I started speaking with the publisher of Economic Collapse News, and he urged me to write this book on the war on cash. And as the more I wrote, the more fascinated I became by this trend, because this is something that's just happened the last few years alone. It hasn't been a long-term trend perpetrated by the government. Only the establishment have been promoting the last couple of years alone, because they understand how if they're able to control you and have an authoritarian way of running your life, if they abolish cash and just have a digital currency system or an electronic system of payments, and which would be able to surveil you and would be able to track every payment you make and to ensure that you are forced into the banking system and participate in the system that you may not otherwise want to. So, as an inherent skeptic of government and statism and politicians, the war on cash was a little bit down my line, because I learned what is being done in front of our very own eyes to control us, and that's something everyone should be frightened of. Although we don't think about it when we go to a coffee shop and we tap our card for a cup of coffee, or we don't think about it when some technology company develops a system where you just flick your wrist, or you put your heartbeat towards something, or you have rhythmic. The company uses rhythmic beat to pay for a product, or perhaps even your eyes soon. An eye scanner to help pay for an item. So the war on cash is something that's accelerating as we speak, and every day there's always a report about a government that is getting rid of currency, as we see, or denomination, as you see in India, or you have the World Economic Forum openly talking about abolishing cash and embracing a digital currency system. And then what's even fascinating is that you have central banks and governments and politicians even promoting the idea of digital currency. Because if you remember when Bitcoin first rose to prominence, you had central bank after central bank after central bank, and government after government after government, and politician after politician after politician, talking about how Bitcoin, Litecoin, Dogecoin, even the Ron Paul coin, talk about how dangerous they are, because the Bitcoins are for the nefarious and for the unscrupulous, and they're out to hurt you, and they're paying for guns, and they're paying for drugs, and they're paying for terrorist activities, and only the evil use digital currencies. But fast forward to today, we see more central banks, not all, but more of them, hop on the digital currency bandwagon, because and perhaps you'll go into this further, digital currencies are a perfect way to track and surveil you. I know the creators of digital currencies have the right intentions and want to be off the grid and don't want to be tracked by government and don't want to fall to the fiat hegemony. But unfortunately, that is what is happening. Whether it's Bitcoin or a central bank developing its own digital currency like China or England are doing, digital currencies are a perfect way to monitor you and track you and surveil you. Sure, perhaps some people think this is a conspiracy theory, but government never has the best interest in your mind. And they will openly tell you that we're doing this for your own good. But if you're someone who's lived long enough, you will see the government never does anything for your own good.
Right. And so when it comes to cryptocurrencies, I myself have been kind of 50-50, somewhat skeptical, but yet always hopeful for the best. But yet I don't think it's a coincidence that, right after our, recession, collapse or whatever of our monetary system, partially that happened not long ago, a new savior arrives in the form of some type of digital currency that is supposed to be safe and an alternative to what we have. And, the government initially put out a little bit of, fighting to it, saying we're going to, we have to regulate it. It has to be controlled. But yet they've kind of died down since. And so why are they so quiet about it, in my opinion, to where is this a part of their rollout plan for what's coming next to just introduce the idea of digital payments in this magnitude? And then also, and another thing, when it comes to the dollar itself, most of the transactions we already have are already digital as far as just swiping our card. And so it's digital dollars, basically. So we are already actually in a digital age. And so the whole idea is the threat on cash. So, it's an interesting point. So it's going to be interesting to see over time how this all plays out. But I want to touch on India a little bit because you hinted at that about the denominations being removed. I had a gentleman from India who kind of gave a different perspective. He was saying how he seemed to be pro-government as far as it being helpful for his country to weed out those that don't pay tax. And so he was saying that most of the transactions take place in cash. And so he was happy that the government was doing what they're doing so that everybody could pay their fair share. So what are your thoughts about that? I mean, can that be a legitimate argument that people can use, that it'd be best if we go cashless so that everyone can pay their fair share?
Yes, that is one point I neglected from my diatribe a few moments ago. That's another concept that they keep promoting, that digital currencies or the abolishment of cash will ensure that everyone pays their taxes and pays their fair share. Of course, once again, since it comes from a government mouthpiece or a status, they will inevitably make the case that you have to abolish cash in order to evade taxes. Now, there isn't much evidence to suggest that people are using digital currencies or using cash in order to avoid taxation. I mean, you have many tax agencies who are employing all these different measures and weapons in order to ensure that you are paying your taxes, whether it's being paid in cash or whether it's being using Bitcoin. In Canada recently, the Canada Revenue Agency, some people know it as Revenue Canada, they recently started to monitor waiters and waitresses and those who are normally paid through tips and cash. And then they audit these same people because they know that there is an underground economy or there are people who are just predominantly paid in cash, and that is starting to gradually wane. Now, the IRS, they are considering the same thing. There are many officials within the Trump administration, or at least during the Trump campaign in 2016, where they said they wanted to hire more IRS agents in order to combat tax evasion and tax avoidance. Now, people, for the most part, do pay their taxes, or they utilize loopholes. Now, the big concern for people like ourselves, or at least I'm speaking for myself, is that it's not so much tax avoidance, and that the big government and their own levels of spending and taxation. If you have a few people avoiding their taxes because they don't want to pay for senseless wars, then it's completely up to them. If people don't want if people are trying to skim 10% of their taxes because they don't want to pay for a corrupt system in order to have politicians pay for their $15 orange juices or to go on lavish vacations, then it's completely up to them. So even if that was the case, that you have cash and digital currencies are ensuring that you avoid paying taxes, then good for them. Let's legalize not paying taxes.
Yeah, interesting point there. Now let's get into the idea that the Federal Reserve note is currently the world reserve currency, and so there's a lot of activity trying to diversify that option there. Now, when it comes to cashless society and the push to remove cash, it's good to say that the Federal Reserve note or the dollar might be the last currency on the block to get chopped off as far as being accessible in cash form. So share with me your thoughts about looking ahead in the future. Can you see a time where the $100 bill, $50 bill, is removed? Or say, for example, some people say we might hit a hyperinflation. So could you see like a $500 Federal Reserve note or a $1,000 Federal Reserve note coming into play? You never know, but yeah, just some things to throw out there. What are your thoughts? Could it go the other way, or could it go the hyperinflation way?
Well, see, those are two interesting points, and they are somewhat contradictory because you have people like Larry Summers and you have people like Joseph Stiglitz who say that you have to start banning certain denominations of currency. I think it was Summers who wanted to get rid of the $100 bill and eventually the $50 bill. But at the same time, when you're going to have massive waves of inflation in the coming future, then aren't you going to have $500 bills in the face of Barack Obama, or a $1,000 bill with the face of Janet Yellen, or perhaps even Donald Trump? So I don't know how they can have their cake and eat it too, because they want to get rid of cash, but then of course you're going to have large amounts of denominations like they had in Zimbabwe, or like they had in or Venezuela, or they had in the Weimar Republic during the in Germany during the 1920s and 1930s. So it's hard to see what the future will look like because these politicians and these statists and establishment they keep contradicting themselves. So who knows if you're going to perhaps let's put it this way. Perhaps they will get rid of the $100 denomination or a $50 denomination bill, but then when the inflation comes in, then they'll reinstate that $50 bill or $100 bill or introduce a $500 bill.
Yeah, so
that's coming for you.
Yeah, and those are two extreme cases right there. But yeah, just stuff to consider, being that we never know what lies ahead, knowing that something is inevitable. And so you hinted at an economic collapse early on in our conversation. So paint a picture for what an economic collapse will look like, there in Canada or here in the United States, where we're the leading nations on the planet for the most part. So we live pretty good, as I must say, compared to the rest of the world. So can you see a time of things balancing out to where people in, say, Africa or in the Asian area may have, a nice house and 2-3 cars, and the shoe is on the other foot, as some people like to say. Speak on that for me.
Well, if you thought the economic collapse in 2008, 2009 was bad, then you're in for quite a treat in the coming years. Who knows when it's going to be, but it's going to happen. If you compare today's time to 2006, there are a lot of parallels. You're starting to see house flipping becoming a huge market share of the real estate industry again. You're starting to see credit card debt mimic the numbers that were in 2006. You're starting to see delinquency rates starting to climb, whether it's in education, whether it's credit card debt, or even mortgage debt. So I've written a couple of articles on economiccollapsenews.com that says it's 2006 all over again. What the future entails, it's going to be an inflationary problem, because especially over the next 4 to 8 years, whoever knows how long he's going to be in power, you have Donald Trump who wants to stimulate the economy with $1 trillion. Now, it's going to be hard to do that when the U.S. will be in a recession, because you have the Federal Reserve writing a report saying that they're going to need at least $4 trillion to combat the next recession. Now, that's going to be pretty hard. It's going to be hard to achieve because you already have a near $5 trillion balance sheet, and then you're going to add another $4 trillion on top of that. So you're starting to see that $4.5 trillion seep into the economy, and of course the capital goods sector has been soaring. I mean, the S&P is worth now $20 trillion, and then of course as that money seeps into the economy, it goes into the middle lower classes whose dollars are worth less and less and less. And then, of course, you have the currency war. You have Donald Trump who's flirting with the idea of a weak dollar policy. Now, the weak dollar policy means inflation. and those dollars you have in your pockets are worth less because he wants to have more exports. Of course, when you're an export country, you want to have a weaker currency. So when you already have the Chinese yuan or the Japanese yen who are already trying to devalue their currency in order to compete, you have the U.S. dollar. You have the U.S. dollar following suit. So in the war, when you compare the global economy, what currencies are going to be strong and which ones are going to be quite weak? Is the whole planet going to partake in a currency war? Is the euro, however long it lasts, is it also going to participate in the currency war? Is the South African rand going to do that? Is the Australian dollar going to do that? Is the Canadian dollar going to do that? So when it comes to an economic collapse, it's going to be primarily inflation. That's the biggest issue that everyone should be concerned about. And there have been projections over the last few years that inflation is coming, and it hasn't come to fruition. But that's because most people didn't understand how much of the game the Federal Reserve was and how much it is trying to limit the inflationary impact on the average American. I mean, they're paying banks just to keep money from entering the system. I mean, that's a nice little income from the Federal Reserve. The next issue is that in order to curb the inflation, the Federal Reserve, just like they did during the Paul Volcker days, they're going to raise interest rates in order to limit the inflation impact. Now, as I mentioned near the beginning of the video, with so much debt that people have, it's going to be hard for the average person to pay off those debts when interest rates are 5, 6, 7, 8%, or just at the historic level, which I think was either 4 or 5%. And then, of course, that's going to impact government, because governments, the United States government anyway, they have $20 trillion national debt. And then by the time I think Trump leaves office, it's going to be around $30 or $35 trillion. Now we have rates that high, however high it's going to be. It's going to be hard for governments in order to pay everything they have without making any spending cuts. So eventually they're going to be forced to make those spending cuts. And eventually the only things the U.S. government is going to be able to pay for to service the debt, maybe some levels of Social Security, and perhaps keep the doors of Congress open. That's pretty much it. And the U.S. economy is very much reliant on what the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve do. I mean, every time Janet Yellen sneezes, stocks react one way or the other. Every time she just says hello, you have a stock going up or going down. So the economic collapse is going to be far worse than it was a few years ago, and that's only because so much money has been printed and so much debt has been accumulated. There's never been this much debt in the history of the world, and that's rather terrifying, because it's not only terrible for the average person, but it's a reminder that politicians have no idea what they're doing. They still believe in that Keynesian concept whereby in order to stimulate an economy, you have to take on debt. Now, they say that they take on debt in order to stimulate or to have a boom. But then when the bust happens, how they're going to pay off that debt when you have interest rates at 10%?
Yeah, good point there. Now, you did a good job of painting how things can unfold, and it's not going to be very pleasant. So let's talk about now how we can kind of not necessarily avoid, but yet protect, shelter, however you want to call it, to ourselves and our family and our posterity down the line. So let's talk about, I guess, sound money, alternative ways of preparing for the storm that's coming. Share with me your thoughts and some things you may have shared in the War on Cash, your book.
Well, first I'd like to say that I'm very pleased that there are some jurisdictions in the United States that are trying to normalize sound money. Now, in sound money, I'm talking about gold and silver. The state of Arizona, they're trying to pass a bill whereby you can purchase goods with gold and silver, which would combat the fiat hegemony that's maintained by the Federal Reserve. Now, in order to ensure that your wealth is protected, you have to look at precious metals. You have to look at real commodities. You have to look at outside of North America, which can be pretty hard to do, as reasons we discussed. But there are ways to protect yourself. You know, don't hold too many dollars in the bank account, because when the banks falter, they will. Look at it this way: it's Cyprus a few years ago, when the economy collapsed and the banks were on the fault of ruin. They imposed a 10% haircut. Now, at first, that was for everybody, and then with the demonstrations, they eventually raised that to people who, with a minimum of 100,000 euros, I think it was. So you shouldn't have too much money in your bank account. I think the FDIC, their threshold is $250,000. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the FDIC, however, it's pretty hard to do that, because the FDIC, they're broke as it is. I mean, the FDIC doesn't have enough money to cover the entire country if the bank system falters. So that's another difficulty you have there. But so gold, silver, commodities outside of North America, perhaps East Asia is a good choice. Singapore, they're doing very well. Swiss, they're doing quite well because they haven't been a part of the European Union sinking ship.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of ways to protect yourself, but it can be very difficult when you have the average person who has $5,000 in their bank account and they use their entire income to pay for their bills because you're already seeing price inflation go up and you're seeing inflation it's already tinkering up and it's going to be massive in the coming future. So again, I don't want to be a Cassandra and I don't want to be a negative Nancy, but there aren't too many ways to protect yourself. If you can buy a lot of gold, you can buy a lot of silver. If you can invest in the stock market a certain way, whether in North America or outside of outside the U.S. border, then that's a good step.
All right. So, Andrew, as we draw towards the end of our conversation, want to just get your thoughts on the dollar. Being that the show is called Rethinking the Dollar, share with me your thoughts on a dollar 2, 5, 10 years from now. Will it still be the reserve currency? Will it be used domestically here in the United States as well as used as a savings form for other countries around the world?
Well, for the next 2 years, it's going to be pretty hard to determine, and that is due to the uncertainty surrounding the Trump administration. We have no idea if the president wants to move ahead with a weak dollar policy, pretty much reversing a trend, or a policy established in the 1990s. Longer term than that, though, you can pretty much see that the U.S. dollar is on the verge of collapse, and it won't be the reserve currency of the world anymore. You're going to see Russia veering away from U.S. dollars. You're already seeing Iran veer away from the U.S. dollar. You're probably going to see many OPEC members veering away from the dollar. Now, when it comes to China and Japan, who are the two biggest holders of United States debt, who knows what they're going to do? Because if they dump the U.S. dollar, then they're pretty much wasting an investment that they had in the U.S. dollar, propping it up after all these years. So it's hard to fathom what the central banks, what the People's Republic of China will do, or what the BOJ will do in 10 years from now. But if you're looking for a wager, then you should not bet on the U.S. dollar at all. It's one thing that you should avoid entirely. Because in the future, there are only two things that the United States government can do when it comes to all the debt that they owe China, for instance. They can either inflate the money supply in half, and which is probably the choice that many politicians want to make, because it means they have less obligations, even though the populace will be the ones who will ultimately bear the brunt of it, or they'll say, we can't pay it. But in another situation, their inflation happens, and the currency is devalued. So U.S. dollar, avoid it.
All right. Wow. Interesting. Andrew, so give me a favor. Share with the audience where they can find you at, how they can get a copy of your book, how to follow your work, and things like that.
Well, as you mentioned at the start of the show, my portfolio page is andrewmoran.wordpress.com, and you can find my work every day at economiccollapsenews.com. You can also find my work over at startingbusiness.com and learnbonds.com. You can find War and Cash on Amazon. It's an ebook. It's only $1, and eventually will be published in paperback when I have time. I mean, I'm flooded with work right now, so I'm not able to have a paperback edition yet of the War and Cash. But it is doing very well, so I will be sure to have a paperback edition and an updated edition, because that book, War and Cash, was written last year. And so much has happened last year when it comes to the War and Cash. So it should be interesting to find out what else is going on in the quest to vanquish.
Yeah, but thank you for sitting down. Looking forward to continue to follow your writing and wish you the best with your book. And other than that, let's stay in touch and hopefully wish and pray for the best for 2017.
It's been a pleasure, Mike. I hope your audience enjoys our conversation.
Thank you.